starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the National Hispanic and Latino ITTC's webinar, Providing Culturally Competent Supervision when Working with Hispanic and Latino Populations. Today's webinar will be presented by Dr. Michelle Evans, and I would like to let our audience know that hopefully we can do more of these webinars and include them as part of our trainings. But I will tell you more about our presenter in a few minutes. During today's webinar, all participants will be muted. The audio will be streamed to the computer, so please make sure your computer speakers are turned on and off to hear today's presentation. I'm going to review a few housekeeping items with everyone. If you notice that your viewer does not fit your screen, you can expand it by clicking the expand button located on the top right corner indicated by the red arrow right here. Now you'll see that your viewer is expanded to fit the entire screen. Also, you can collapse the GoToWebinar toolbar on the right of your screen by clicking on the small red arrow on the left of the toolbar. And then click the arrow again to expand the toolbar, and it will expand. As I mentioned, for today's webinar, all participants will be muted. So as we move through the presentation, if you have questions for our presenter, we ask that you use the chat box on the toolbar. Simply type your question and hit send, and we will leave a few minutes after the end of the presentation to answer any questions. Also, if we don't have enough time to answer all of your questions, what we'll do is that we'll provide a Word document with questions and answers, and it will be available at our website. A recording of today's webinar along with the PowerPoint slides will be available at our website, www.attcnetwork/Hispanic Latino, approximately 1 week from today. You can also find recordings and PowerPoint presentations from all of our past webinars at the same URL. One NADAC, one NBCC, and one ICNRC continuing education credit is available to those who attend today's live event. So if you're interested in obtaining CEUs from these organizations, please email us at hispaniclatinoittc@uccaribe.edu. Today's webinar is sponsored by the National Hispanic and Latino ITTC. As of October 1st of 2012, the network was restructured and consists of 10 regional ATTCs, 4 national focus area ATTCs, along with the network coordinating office. As you can see by this map, the ATTC network regions were realigned to better fit the HHS regions. And on the left of the screen, you have the 4 national focus area ATTCs. So today's webinar is the 28th in a series that the National Hispanic and Latino has been offering. The ATTC network is funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration and serves a critical role in improving the health of the U.S. The network achieves this by translating, disseminating, and promoting the adoption and implementation of evidence-based clinical practices and strives to improve the health and wellness of individuals whose lives have been impacted by substance use disorders. So if you wish to learn more about the network's products and programs, you can visit attcnetwork.org. As I mentioned, the ATTC network is funded by SAMHSA. SAMHSA strives to reduce the impact of substance use and mental illness on America's communities through its programs and services, and demonstrates that behavioral health is essential to health, that prevention works, treatment is effective, and people recover from mental and substance use disorders. If you want to learn more about SAMHSA, you can visit their website at www.samhsa.gov. So now I'll tell you a little bit more about our presenter. Dr. Michelle Evans is a licensed clinical social worker, certified alcohol and drug counselor, and licensed sex offender treatment provider with experience in individual and family counseling and in developing therapeutic groups. She has worked primarily with the Latino population throughout her career as a bilingual and bicultural social worker. She's the Assistant Dean for Health Professions and Public Service at Wabaunsee Community College in Sugar Grove, Illinois, and an adjunct professor and researcher at Aurora University. She's also in private practice at Nickerson and Associates, PC, as a bilingual therapist where she treats adults and adolescents with mental health issues, substance use issues, and sex addictions. Previously, she held positions within public and private psychiatric hospitals. Michelle Evans earned a Doctor of Social Work and Master of Social Work degree from Aurora University in Aurora, Illinois. So before we begin our presentation, we're going to do our poll questioning. And we'll start now. Our first question. Do you currently serve Hispanic and Latino populations with substance use disorders? Yes or no? And 79% of our participants say yes, 23% say no. Next question. Are you planning to serve Hispanic and Latino populations with substance use disorders in the next 6 months? We have 76% say yes, 9% say no, and 14% don't know. What is your current professional role? Okay, so for this question we have 14% social worker, 29% counselor or therapist, 10% faculty research or student, 15% government official or policymaker, and 34% other. What type of setting do you currently work in? And we have 6% academic, 35% treatment, 5% research, 32% government, and 22% other. Now some questions related to our presentation. According to Gloria, Hurt, and Tao, supervisees often have greater cultural competence and training than their supervisor. Yes or no? And we have 71% say true, 29% say false. Next question related to the presentation. It is common for supervisors to consider cultural issues and possible effects on the supervision triad. Lunch. Okay, and 44% say true and 54% say false. The multidimensional ecological comparative approach integrates culture with all learning. And 94% say true, 6% say false. Okay? Perfect. So now I'm going to leave you with our presenter and Dr. Michelle Evans.
All right, well, good, let's see, for some of you it's good afternoon, for some of you it's good morning. I know where I am, it's certainly good morning. I'm so excited to be here with you today as this is a really important topic. I don't know if you've had a similar experience. If you happen to have knowledge of certain cultures, and all of us do to some extent, I got involved in thinking about supervision and specifically culturally competent supervision because even as a very young worker, and I'm a social worker, even as a very, very new social worker that spoke Spanish, I found myself with the responsibility of educating everyone around me as to the needs of the Hispanic and Latino population. And interestingly enough, at least in my experience, when you come into a new job, you're a brand new social worker, you don't know a lot even about what you're doing in terms of your job, and all of a sudden people are asking you, well, what should I do here? Well, do you have any advice? And it's a little disorienting. And I found that with some very strong mentors, I was able to kind of bridge that. But I've seen around me often other individuals who are brand new to the field but who happen to be bicultural or bilingual being given that responsibility. There are individuals, and if there isn't someone who has kind of a cultural knowledge as to the Hispanic and Latino population, often I've seen things that have happened that are definitely difficult for those people that, for the clients that are being served. And so, therefore, with that kind of knowledge, I understand most likely a lot of our attendees today are either supervisors or perhaps have found themselves in that position. If you're not Hispanic or Latino, you might be of a different culture, and often the second a question comes up, or a client of your same heritage comes to the agency, frequently you might also be asked, well, what do you think? And that can happen also with gender and age. Hey, you're a young person, you know, my client is this age, you're about her, what do you think? And so we get that all of the time because often when we're thinking about culturally competent work, when you ask people, well, how do you treat somebody culturally competently if you have no knowledge? It's like, you know, first thing that comes to mind is, well, ask somebody who might have some knowledge. And sometimes today I have some information that might say that's a good start, but that's not everything we need to know. So to get started, here are some of my objectives today, and this is, I'm really going to focus my presentation in such a short presentation on supervision, and then I'll tie it together along the way with working with Hispanic and Latino individuals in my experience. But hopefully we'll get some understanding as to supervision overall. And so first of all, let's do a couple of definitions so we're all clear on what we're talking about. So supervision, according to NASW best practice supervision standards, and many different professions have different standards, professional supervision is defined as the relationship between a supervisor and a supervisee in which the responsibility and accountability for the development of competence, demeanor, and ethical practice take place. I frequently work with MSW students in their last semester, and I think you can ask just about any one of them, do they feel prepared for everything that their profession is going to demand? And you'll hear a resounding no. But that's with the understanding that the degree is a very foundational degree for any of our degrees, whether it's counseling, addictions, you know, whatever it may be. And the practice and the supervision that happens after that graduation, that is actually where that development of competence and ethical practice occurs. The supervisor is tasked with a very big responsibility as they're responsible to provide direction to the supervisee. And with that, they need to know how to apply theory, knowledge, skills, competency, ethical content in that practice setting wherever they may be. The supervisor and the supervisee share the responsibility for carrying out that role in this collaborative process. And sometimes we see this, you know, we see supervisees who are very eager or some that are less eager. And the same thing with supervisors. Some are more eager, you know, to help learn and or teach and mentor, and some are a little less than eager. It is impossible to be a competent supervisor if one does not have the ability to address issues of diversity in both the supervisory relationship and in the supervisee's relationship with clients. So this requires a double knowledge of both the supervisor's understanding of culture and the supervisee's. Because culture incorporates the influences of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, religion, class, and so forth on our thoughts, assumptions, and behaviors, it's possible to conceptualize all supervision as multicultural. Therefore, it's essential to consider the socio-cultural political identities of the supervisory triad that includes the client, supervisee, and the supervisor. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this, and that's when I, as a supervisor, am talking to my supervisee, instantly that's a multicultural communication. And if I don't understand the cultural influence on my supervisee, there can be a disconnect. And then through that supervisee, there's the client, thus forming that triad of, if I'm effectively communicating with my supervisee but not taking into account the influence of my supervisee's relationship with the client and their differences or similarities in culture, we can be missing some of those cultural nuances that can impact the relationship overall. And so just, to kind of give another definition today, what is culture? And so for today's presentation, because even within the literature there's many different definitions of culture, we'll define it as the dynamic and active process of constructing shared meaning as represented by shared ideas, beliefs, attitudes, values, norms, practices, language, spirituality, and symbols with an acknowledgement and consideration of positions of power, privilege, and oppression. And I think that definition fits best today, understanding that we're discussing dynamic and moving relationships between the supervisor, supervisee, and the client. And so this is something that is ever changing, even as our client or even as our supervisee increases in knowledge, perhaps increases in position within employment, culture can continue to change. It's not a static thing that once we have it, we have it. So I know I have a group of supervisees that I work with for their LCSW, and I have a supervisee specifically who I met when she actually was working with me as an intern. And at that time, I remember her well as a very young, incredibly young person who came in, was very timid, very hesitant. And over time, I've known her, maybe almost a decade now, and I've watched her go from the new clinician to now a more advanced clinician, and watching how her culture of as a professional has changed, and how she understands things has changed, how she speaks about things, her vocabulary changes, and how her norms and practices, even in her own life, not just professional life, but in her personal life, she does things differently based on the knowledge and attitudes that she has gained. And so especially when we're providing long-term supervision, it's important to recognize that our supervisees continue to change, as do we. And so things that that made sense to even me, early on in my career may now be changing, and that includes when we discuss our own race and ethnicity. And so, so my last definition here is cultural competence, and how we'll define it today are those knowledge, skills, and attitudes in domains of the therapist awareness, personal values, and biases. We also need to understand the worldview of individuals who are culturally different and culturally similar, with a focus on developing cultural intervention strategies and techniques appropriate to each situation. And I think this is the one key thing to take a look at here, is that culturally different and culturally similar. Because often we assume that the more alike we are, the less there's cultural conflict. However, research actually shows the more similar we are, the less culturally competent we tend to be, because we become blind. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go along. But I remember I had a supervisee who, kind of looked like me. She definitely resembled me, and I didn't ask her anything about her race and ethnicity. But she resembled me, and we were going back and forth, and she had dark hair and dark eyes like I do. Over time, we started talking about cultural competence during our supervision, and all of a sudden I found out she was Polish. And I was completely, it completely took me off guard, because I live in a very Hispanic community where, if somebody looks like you, they most likely are of Hispanic or Latino descent. And here, and she had lived in my area as well, and I didn't ask, and it was that because she appeared to be culturally similar, from a similar area, similar generation, I didn't even think about it. And here there are many things that I had missed about our culture, and even about how she was perceiving our relationship, that had I asked, it certainly would have benefited both of us. And so, with this, diversity and multicultural competence includes developing an awareness of the many strands of the supervisee and client's identities, including sex and gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, social class, sexual orientation, heritage, immigration, and generational experiences, ableness, religion, and spirituality. And so we have to understand how those strands of identity combine for the supervisee and supervisor and the therapist and the client. I know I'm a second-generation immigrant. My father immigrated here from Mexico, and therefore, even as I work with, again, I live in a very community as a lot of Hispanic individuals, and often I'm talking to first-generation immigrants who, look like me, speak like me, but and if I don't take into account just their experiences as a Mexican American in this case, I can certainly miss a lot of important information. Our goal is a stance of cultural humility. It's that idea that I only know myself. I am the expert of me, especially regarding culture, and therefore I have to ask every single person about their cultural history and about what's important to them to learn that. Multicultural competence is inseparable from social justice and advocacy, and that leads right into it. So what does this look like in supervision? So the power meta concept of cultural humility is a valuable tool to incorporate a commitment to critical self-reflection, self-evaluation, and self-critiquing, essential to that multicultural awareness. And so adopting that offers an approach to address and redress power dynamics and imbalances in that client, therapist, supervisor dynamic, and to instill humility in relationships with both clients and supervisees that are respectful of individual and community contextual mores and practices. A little later in this presentation, I'm going to talk about how to actually conceptualize culture, because I know that sometimes one of my favorite sayings is that culture is like skin. You don't feel it until it rubs up against someone else's. And so later on in this presentation, I'm going to give you some specific things to look for, because similar to assessing cognition, every time we talk to somebody, we're assessing their cognition. Do I need to change my vocabulary? Do I need to change how I speak or what I'm speaking about? And culture, in some ways, can be defined a similar way if you know what to look for. Just like with cognition, if I say, well, I have to look at how they're using language, the quality of vocabulary. With culture, we can do some similar things, and I'm going to talk about that a little later. So there are some challenges. So here's some of the challenges when we look at supervision. There are a lack of ongoing education for supervisees. Supervisors with a low awareness of cultural competence are less likely to bring up issues of cross-cultural practice, which is magnified due to the power differential between the supervisor and supervisee. And often, as we mentioned in our question today, supervisees often have a greater cultural competence and training than the supervisor. And this is specifically due to some of our educational practices currently going on in our programs, as cultural competence, as we've taught it and as we've had more of an emphasis on it over the last decade and a half or so, our current students have gotten a better education as to cultural competence, as opposed to some of our supervisors who have decades of experience, but this might not have ever been something that they focus on. This can also differ depending on states. Some states require CEUs with cultural competence nowadays, and some don't. And then even the availability of good CEUs, that is definitely a factor regarding whether supervisors have good knowledge. And so I know in several, even in agencies near me, again, the person doing the cultural competence is a person who's bilingual and bicultural, but they might not have the experience to provide a good and solid cultural competence training. And so that's an issue that we certainly have in our field. So some challenges and skills: lack of integrated training, as I mentioned, and there's really not a lot of guidelines for multicultural practice and supervision. So that's certainly a deterrent to good practice. There's a specific lack of discussion in supervision regarding cultural competence, regarding diversity, and that supervisors frequently use theoretical models that are not resilience-oriented. Luckily, this is something that's beginning to change, and I know the ATTCs are certainly helping with that. in reinforcing the use of evidence-based practice, but up until maybe a decade ago or so, it certainly wasn't the practice. And so we see that constantly as we're working to balance that within the field. And so then challenges and attitudes. Supervisors tend, per research, supervisors tend to initiate discussion regarding ethnicity, sex, and sexual orientation with their supervisees, only infrequently leaving the initiation to supervisees. If any of you have adolescents, and I have adolescents, and I've treated adolescents, and I certainly know any of those uncomfortable topics, usually it's, you wait for that uncomfortable question, and that's, often because of your own hesitancy. And I know I've worked with a lot of parents where it's like, well, we had a 5-minute conversation and they didn't ask any questions, so I figured they knew what they need to know. And unfortunately, that happens exactly the same way when we're talking about cultural competence, because often it's an uncomfortable topic where we have to reflect upon our own culture, and we have to, no matter what with cultural competence, there is always something you don't know, and as is true with just practice in general. And so often that fear of the supervisee asking a question that we can't answer, or opening up a conversation that will lead to both of you feeling rather uncomfortable, is definitely a deterrent. However, I can speak from experience on all of those topics, working with sex addictions. The more you talk about it, the easier it gets to talk about, and the more it's easier to acknowledge. I don't know everything, but here's what I know, and please share with me what you know, so that we can better understand this topic. So supervisors often neglect to fully consider the impact of the client, therapist, and supervisor factors on therapeutic and supervisory processes. Again, because in supervision, often you are talking to the supervisee, and you hear about the client, you understand the client, and I don't know, one of the pitfalls I've had is automatically when a supervisee talks about a client that maybe I've never met, I automatically picture them in my head as somebody I may have previously known, or maybe a combination of factors of clients I've previously known, to fully understand the client. Unfortunately, that kind of practice, and we have to acknowledge that we are blind in certain areas, and we can only increase our knowledge through that supervisory understanding. And so then, of course, supervisors may be less likely to consider their own biases. We're under pressure to be experts. When we're giving supervision, there is some pressure that you should know something. You should know something about a lot of things because you're the supervisor in the relationship. So I'm going to discuss very briefly a few culturally competent supervision models. Well, actually, yeah, I guess a couple. So this will go relatively quickly because I want to move on to the application. We all love application and skills. So practice theory is a model. Alfred Kadushin gave us a model, and there are several models out there. I happen to appreciate his work. He was a social worker, but he's definitely not, there's definitely other models that are actually quite similar as well. And so he discussed the administrative, educational, and supportive roles of supervision. There's another framework out there that talks about normative, formative, and restorative forms of supervision as well, but I won't discuss that one today. And so briefly, administrative supervision is really very similar to management. It's concerned with correct, effective, and appropriate implementation of policy and procedures. It ensures policy is implemented and that there's a responsibility to enable supervisees to do their job. I know I received my clinical supervision, I've received it from a couple of different people over the years, and at times this was supervision, even though it should have been LCSW, that clinical supervision. Often my supervision was the, are you doing your job? What are you doing today? And sometimes when you have a short day, when you're trying to get through your work, it does tend to lead to that. So talking about educational supervision, it focuses on professional concerns as it relates to specific cases. And so often with educational, the goal is to understand the client better, become more aware of reactions to the client, understand the dynamics of how they and the client interact, look at how they intervened, the results of their intervention, and explore other ways of working with this and similar client situations. And so this often involves kind of that teaching point. This happens to be one of my favorite as an instructor. I love this part of supervision, just that exploratory and, hey, let me get me some more knowledge, and this is really cool. Let me tell you about this. Sometimes I know this is kind of my bias personally. The third one is supportive, whereas the first two types really focus on instrumental needs. That supportive is the concerned with expressive needs. And so this one tries to reduce stress in some ways, but also does a little bit of nurturing, and you're encouraging that self-efficacy. And so this is, if you tend to be a natural therapist, they tend to like this area. So I like this area as well sometimes. Because it's really building that rapport where supervisees can develop their sense of identity and really learn and become confident in themselves. And I love watching that process with the supervisees as they become more confident. So just a note, I want to take a sidebar here. When we're thinking about, I know I mentioned at the beginning of some of us being pulled into giving advice as to our culture and cultures that are being served. When we start thinking about our role in doing this, if sometimes giving the administrative, okay, here's how this policy is going to impact this population, based on my knowledge. Or also, you know what, let me tell you about some of the dynamics, some of the cultural norms that the Hispanic and Latino population, have that might impact your intervention. And lastly, just going, you know what, you're doing great in terms of asking your clients what they think and asking them what's going to work best for them. And so sometimes when you're put in that role as the quote-unquote unofficial expert, thinking about these three roles, it works the exact same way in those unofficial supervision roles. And so just as you kind of think about supervision, I don't want this to be limited to just, two people one-on-one, which often we think of as supervision, but also as that, how do we give best back to when we get those questions from our colleagues as to how best serve Hispanic and Latino populations and other cultures as well. So the combination of this framework is necessary for the development of a competent, ethical, and professional providers. And if you remember our definition of supervision at the beginning, so this aligns pretty well with that. So now I'm going to get to the nitty-gritty of the place of culture and supervision. So there's a couple of different models of supervision. Some of them, I like a little bit more than others. So when we think about the universalist, basically what the universalist perspective of culture is pretty much saying that you know enough knowledge. If you know about Hispanic Latinos, you've read a book, you've looked at a website. That's really all you need to know. All cultures, all cultures are different, and so you just have to act like a human, and they're going to act like a human, and a little bit of knowledge is okay, but ultimately it doesn't have a lot of specific advisement as to culture. And so with the universalist model of just we're all human and culture is just a part of being human, there is that model which definitely is not useful in multicultural supervision. With particularist, can't say that, I'm going to jump over here. Well, maybe not. Basically that is looking at of really concentrating on one particular, if I'm working with one Hispanic individual, I have to know everything about it and really, just focus on that, which isn't necessarily very helpful as well. So I'm going to move down to ethnic focused, which this is often in our training, institutions, we use this a little bit more, where it's developing cultural literacy with a separate course lecture with specific content. And so this is where we see culture as something separate that we have to study, almost like having a class on cognition or having a class on trauma, with separate course lecture, and so this is something that even in supervision, all right, today we're going to talk about culture. And then next week we'll go back to discussing your cases. And so it can be helpful to build that knowledge and those skills, but ultimately it's very limited. because ultimately you have to learn that application and that understanding. And so I'm leading you naturally to that multidimensional ecological comparative approach, which Celia Falikov did very well, which integrates culture with all learning, distills diversity in basic systems and parameters, and has generic comparative maps, which I'm going to show you right here. So the first thing that I want you to know about is perspectivism. It's that primary element of culturally competent supervision, and it's necessary to encounter the dynamics of the supervision encounter, which is opposed to the modern idea of objectivism, which states that reality can be grasped through direct knowledge and experience. In other words, a therapist has an implicit standard in their mind which has been developed by his or her own cultural experiences. Often there's the cliche of, if you want to know somebody, walk a mile in their shoes. But what I always say is, unfortunately, my feet don't fit in those shoes. And so if I put your shoes on, chances are they're either going to be way too big, way too small, and I'm really not going to have the experience of living your life as you are. And so I have to have that recognition that I have these permanent glasses affixed to my head, which is called my perspectivism, which I can't get out of. This is just how I see the world, and ultimately that is stuck on me. And so that always just tickles me to think about. So with MECA, this allows the supervisor to acknowledge the universalist, particularist, and ethnic-focused positions, provides a meaningful way to integrate culture into these positions, and as an approach, it focuses on the client's ecological context, family life cycle, migration, acculturation, and family organization. And so I'm going to show you a model here. And so basically, this is the idea of how it looks. It's each one of us, the clinician, which is the supervisee, the supervisor, and then personal life and theory, because we always bring in theory, and that adds a whole nother dynamic. So this is how, when in that supervisor-supervisee dynamic, this is what is going on. And so you can see there's very, very little that's actually overlapping, which is incredibly frightening for most supervisors as to how to grasp it all and pull it in, kind of rein it in. But so personal means personal life, stuff that happens outside of the session, which happens for both the clinician and the supervisor, the knowledge of theory, use of theory, but then both of our ideas and understanding of culture and how we're approaching it and how our own culture impacts us. So I always like to bring this up. This is one thing that I've used in a lot of presentations, usually as an activity, because the one challenge I want to give you is in this model right here, you have answers to every single one of these things. You have an age, a gender, a race, etc. And each one of these things are factors that influence your perspective of culture. And so I'm going to show you mine in a minute, kind of very broken, abbreviated version. But if I don't consider my age and how it affects my supervisee, and in turn how my understanding of my age and my supervisee, how that impacts my client, I'm missing something. But that also includes race and ethnicity and everything else, even where we're working, our seniority, how we see ourselves, marital status. This impacts our culture and how we see things. I'm going to jump over here. So here's my personal ecological profile that I've mentioned. And so here's some things just about me. And so if I don't recognize those and my theoretical profile, just the way I see the world theoretically, if I don't understand these things about myself and then start anticipating how it's going to impact the relationship with my supervisee and how my own biases of being a social worker, and I'm, if you cut me open, I'm made of social worker meat, I usually say, how that bias is going to impact my client who might not see the world as I see it. I have definite perspectives that influence everything I think about and do, which impact the whole relationship triad. And if I'm not well oriented to the items that we had here that are influencing the client as well as the supervisee, and so these are some things that I need to know about the client. And usually in supervision, here's a skill. I usually teach my supervisees to provide me with a case overview that involves these items. in doing that, the supervisee is having to go through, okay, what's the age, what's the gender, what's the sexual orientation, and maybe it's not this complex, but it's usually about, 8 to 10 things that, okay, I want to know these details about the client before we even start talking about their case. That helps me, and this is all usually in your assessment. That helps me understand even where the client is, even recreational habits. I had a Hispanic client once, and it kind of tickled me because his favorite sport was handball. And here he was up in Illinois, and we just don't play that game up here. And it baffled me. It's the first time I'd ever met somebody that played handball. I didn't even know what the sport was, but knowing that told me a lot about his feelings of isolation, that here he was in a new culture, and nobody even played the same sports, had the same hobbies that he did. And knowing that really helped us understand how isolated he felt, so we could design interventions to work with him. So using this MECA, it integrates culture into all elements of supervision. Every problem, every decision is based in that, and there's an understanding of that. Therapist is encouraged by the supervisor to always view families in that comparative socio-cultural context. And there's only one do and don't. Do ask and don't assume, and that's cultural competence overall, So, all right. Now, I told you I'd give you some specific skills, and this I use in just about every presentation because I just love it. And basically, it's the easiest way to conceptualize culture, for me at least. And I have the reference on below, and I can always give you additional references. But when I start thinking about how do I assess culture within my supervisee and my client, here's what I need to know, and I'm going to be very brief with this. But, language includes not just, native language, but also vocabulary, words. I know as a professional, I use a much higher level of vocabulary than many of my clients, and I have to adjust. Otherwise, there's going to be a very big disconnect, and possibly it'll be hard to work together. Persons who we should have involved in our treatment and what they should be doing. Metaphors, understandings of the world. Think of old English class. Similes or like and as, metaphors. It is this. This is how I see things. Content, what we talk about. Concepts, how we understand things. What the concepts that are important for us to discuss. What are my goals? What are the methods to achieve it? And then the context of what environment are we actually in? Where are we? Who are we? What's my role with you? And so being able to assess these 8 areas allows us to start to pinpoint culture, just like as I mentioned before with cognition. If I were to try to identify cognition without a personality, or without a cognitive test, I'd be looking at vocabulary, I'd be looking at understanding, I'd be looking at all sorts of different things, which we do naturally when talking to somebody. Culture works very similarly. Within the Hispanic and Latino population, there are very specific things that Hispanic and Latino individuals tend to align with regarding this. Obviously, Spanish, the native, Spanish language. Persons are tend to be very familial. There can often be metaphors within immigration regarding power and government. We're looking at content. What's important for them to talk about? Usually, it's the safety of the family or the safety of the community, and being able to support each other. Which can also lead into concepts, and goals and your methods can really change based on your client's values, their family involvement, and what community they're returning to or engaging with. And then obviously we have the context of our own relationship and how that affects them. And so when we think about this and we think about what we just talked about a minute ago, back to that wheel, our culture is embedded in this wheel, these things that identify us. Based on my age, I use a certain language. Based on my race and ethnicity, I use certain language, certain words. Based on my ability, there's certain, goals that I have, or certain ways that I'll achieve those goals. Based on my religion, it impacts my metaphors, my understanding. And so even understanding these things are only, slight indicators as to how we can address culture, because ultimately, again, all interactions, all communications is multicultural, and so sometimes it feels kind of intimidating, but this gives you a framework of at least to start to discuss it, questions to ask your supervisee to help them understand how that culture can be integrated into their interventions. And so looking at supervision competencies, we got to have knowledge, and so this is one of the things. This might include the supervisor providing resources to enhance the general knowledge base of the supervisee. So again, attention should be given to the differences and similarities within the triad of client, therapist, supervisor beliefs and values. And there's that individualism versus collectivism, gender, generational hierarchies, that is embedded into our cultures and into our life. And if you even reflect on yourself for a minute and how you see individualism versus collectivism, gender, your generation, those hierarchies, it significantly impact. I know mine are because of my culture and how I grew up and where I am now today. Additionally, we have to teach those skills. And I found something that's been really helpful in providing supervision is really breaking it down for my supervisees. Here's the skill you have to have. You need to be able to assess language needs. You need to be able to assess person needs. Here's how you do it. You ask the client this type of question. Those kind of skills can be very helpful for new supervisees and for, like I mentioned, colleagues that are trying to learn to work with Hispanic and Latino, the Hispanic and Latino population. Here's some questions that might help you in communicating with your client. Who would you like to have in the session with you? Asking that client to a Hispanic or Latino individual can be really helpful because it invites them to bring the family in or to not, if that's their choice. So it just opens up that question. Additionally, we have to practice that self-examination by identifying our own profile, including our attitudes, preconceptions, and biases, by contextualizing the differences by working to understand the socialization forces and perspective issues. This involves applying these skills to understand our relationship, and they preview interventions, narratives, and solutions that integrate culture and social location for the client's presenting problem. In this, my challenge to you supervisors is that you have to take a moment to be concrete in your supervision sessions. Take that pause of supervisee. I'd like to take a moment just to talk about how our culture impacts how we see the client. That conversation can be so important and effective. Hey, you and I are very similar. Is that allowing us to really see the cultural needs of our client? Or, you and I are really different. And so how is that impacting our perception of the client right now? So knowing the question to ask is a skill that we use that's one of our primary skills in the helping professions. And so knowing the right question, it's incredibly important. So then the last one here is the supervision competencies and attitudes. The supervisor and supervisee will identify the coexistence of conflicting meanings and metaphors, and will identify the supervisor and supervisee maps to understand how to integrate those cultural dimensions and social justice concerns. And so as with any kind of attitude, it's all how you look at it. If you look at culture as a positive thing, it's going to go well. If not, it's going to be a little more difficult to talk about. And so here's just a couple of notes, and I'm going to go through this because I've given you the basic foundation. So at this point, this is really just a review for application. So within the supervision model, there can be misunderstandings at multiple levels. When I wrote this out, it just baffled me because supervisor is race A, client is race B, client's race A. That's, one thing. Supervisor is race A, supervisor is race A, client is race B, and so we have all of those different possibilities, and each one presents unique challenges. By the way, I think I forgot a supervisee up at the top there. Each one is a different challenge where either there's some difference that we have to overcome, or even in the last one, we're all similar, which means, according to research, we're very likely not to even think about it. So this, we all have different styles, which is based on our communication style, which is dependent on each individual's temperament, expectations, and goals. So this goes back to that big wheel I showed you a little while ago. So when we understand who we are, then the productivity and satisfaction increases. So here's some things that we can do. Make it explicit that that reflexivity and attention diversity and multicultural factors are a supervisory and a professional responsibility. So we got to own it. We got to own that this is something we have to bring up. Creating a safe environment by attention to the supervisory relationship and alliance by providing those openness, genuineness, warmth, empathy, respect, and collaborative, non-judgmental stance. And so ultimately we have to be comfortable with our supervisee and our colleagues not knowing stance, that they just don't know. When you give that, all of a sudden the questions start coming. So actually be careful, because you might start getting more questions about culture, which is great in my world. Modeling reflexivity and cultural humility. So, as a supervisor, you are the role model. You know, you have to value and respect the supervisee's multicultural identities and perspectives, and they're not knowing. And consider with the supervisee the impacts of diversity and multicultural identities in the supervisee relationship. One thing I'd like to refer you to, and you can look at this for later, or certainly, you know, contact me later for this. Comas Diaz and Jacobson wrote an article, Ethnocultural Transference and Countertransference in the Therapeutic Dyad. This is one of my favoriteest articles in the whole world because it talks about the issues between interethnic transference and intra-ethnic transference. And there's a lot there that I don't have time to go over, that of all the pitfalls of things that where we can get stuck when our supervisee is similar to us and different. Now they're writing about the client, but they talk about, you know, when we're similar, you know, we become ambivalent, we become, you know, where we don't see things. And so it's a very interesting article if you want more about this, just a note. Additionally, we have to present, discuss, and provide didactic material, that's that educational piece, about the ways which gender, class, and ability contribute to relationships of privilege and oppression. We have to direct and support reflexive activities such as mindfulness in session and outside of sessions, and then use self-assessment and inquiry tools to enhance reflection. You know, and then address barriers to multicultural competence by empathy-based attention to sources of discomfort. In other words, if your conversation is uncomfortable, that is fantastic, because now you know what you have to work on. You know, that's one of my favorite times, is when both of us are sitting there going, I don't know what to say. And it's like, then obviously we have a discussion if we don't have anything to say, which is really, really goofy, but that's the wonders of supervision and the work we do. And then engaging in that collaborative reflection, you know, an assessment of the effectiveness of supervisory activities. Are we doing a good job? Are we doing what we need to do? Supports the development of that competence and elicits recommendations for improvement. And so here are just a few things. You know, here's my bottom line of what you have to do. And so culturally competent work, when you actually put it in your head and you say, this is what I'm going to talk about, can be incredibly powerful, especially, you know, I've used it a lot with the Hispanic and Latino populations, you know, and with colleagues even outside of the supervision session. And so here's just some things to think about. And I think now I'm going to send it back to our hosters, and we'll see if you have any questions. So.
Thank you, Michelle. Hold on. Our first question is, in your experience, are agencies and supervisees open to discussing cultural issues as part of supervision?
I think it's difficult, often when we sometimes when you bring up a topic and you talk about it and you identify deficits, that means you have to do something about it. And so I think that this sometimes is the struggle where the conversation regarding cultural competencies in our supervisors and supervisees, when we start talking about it in agencies, and this is my experience, it becomes so complex, and we identify that we have a need for knowledge and for and we have a need to do something about it, and sometimes that's hard, and you know, with lack of funding or even with lack of time. I think cultural competence is seen as something that we need a lot of time to do, but in reality, it's when it's embedded in our work directly. It really doesn't take much more time, and actually saves time, because clients who are treated in a culturally competent manner get better faster and their treatment is more effective. And so in actuality, it's something that is well worth the investment. But in my experience, there's often a hesitance as to, do I know enough about cultural competence to be able to speak to it effectively in my agency and do something about it?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. We have another question. Someone wants to know who the authors of the transference article that you mentioned in the end, Comas Diaz, and the second author.
Yes, the second one is Jacobson. So it's Lillian Comas Diaz, and then, oh, I forgot his first name, but Jacobson. The article was written in 1991, and, oh, I just turned my page, but it is, if you Google ethnocultural transference, ethnocultural transference is one of my favorite topics. I actually wrote about it in my dissertation. Here it is, ethnocultural transference and countertransference in the therapeutic dyad. Gomez Diaz and Jacobson, 1991.
Okay, so I send the names to everyone so that in case someone wants to look it up, you will have the last names of the authors.
Wonderful.
So we don't have any more questions so far. If we receive more questions, I will send them to Dr. Evans, and we can include them with the recording of today's presentation in case anyone wants to have a look at it. Okay. Let me see. Maybe we have another one. Is there something specific about supervising clinicians who are seeing Hispanic populations that we should consider?
I think it is important as supervisors that we inform ourselves as to the cultural needs of the Hispanic and Latino population. One of my favorite, and I say this as a clinician, not as a speaker right now, but the National Hispanic and Latino ATTC has provided me with a lot of resources, and they're up on the website, I know, and I found that to be a wonderful resource, especially these webinars. You know, and often I've referred individuals who are not as informed as me to many of those webinars and the materials because it's offered in all sorts of formats. And it's under SAMHSA. I mean, SAMHSA has done a wonderful job in making sure that as clinicians we have a lot of those materials. And so I would say ultimately as a supervisor, inform yourself, you know, and make sure that you recognize that there are many very special needs of the Hispanic and Latino population regarding their the way they see things, and a lot of those things I mentioned, the way the language, the people they want involved, you know, and their view of even treatment and the treatment provider. And I know we've had quite a few other webinars that have spoken to that, so I highly recommend them. They've certainly helped me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So those are the questions for now. As I mentioned, if we have any more questions, we'll send them to you and we'll include them along with the recording of today's webinar. So again, I would like to take a moment to thank Dr. Evans for your time. And just again, a reminder, we will have a recording of today's webinar along with the PowerPoint slides available at our website, www.attcnetwork.org. Hispanic and Latino. We also have a handout available at our website. So that concludes today's webinar. If you're interested in receiving further training on this topic, please let us know and look at our website to learn about future webinars. So as you leave today's webinar, you'll be directed to complete a brief survey about your experience. Your feedback is very important to us, and we appreciate you taking the time to let us know what you thought of the webinar. So that's it. Thank you so much and have a great day.